Camilla, where have you been? Been looking for you since I returned.
Billionaire went to evict a poor family, but was shocked to see a single mother with a child who... Distinguished viewers, welcome to Luxury True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more amazing real-life luxury stories. Now, let's get into the story. David Sylvester grew up in a quiet industrial city where many families struggled to survive. His father, Richard Sylvester, worked long hours as a mechanic in a small repair shop, while his mother, Laura Sylvester, ran a tiny grocery store beneath their modest apartment. Money was always scarce, but Richard believed deeply in hard work and discipline, and Laura filled their home with warmth and encouragement despite their hardships. From a young age, David noticed the contrast between the worn-down buildings around him and the tall, shining towers he saw in magazines and newspapers. Unlike other children who spent their days playing outside, David was fascinated by buildings. He would sit by the window with a notebook, sketching different designs of houses and skyscrapers, imagining cities that were modern, beautiful, and strong. His parents noticed his curiosity and supported him however they could. Laura often told him that dreams were powerful, while Richard reminded him that determination was what turned dreams into reality. Those words stayed with David and slowly shaped his ambitions. One afternoon, David overheard a wealthy landlord speaking harshly to a struggling tenant outside their building. The man spoke with cold authority, reminding everyone that the building belonged to him and that those who could not pay had no right to stay. The moment left a deep impression on David. Standing quietly by the staircase, he made a silent promise to himself that one day he would become successful enough to own buildings of his own. But unlike that landlord, he wanted to build a life where people could feel safe, respected, and valued. That promise became the first spark of the journey that would one day transform David Sylvester into one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. Camilla Bennett grew up in a large house that looked beautiful from the outside but felt cold and unwelcoming inside. After the death of her parents, Howard Bennett and Grace Bennett, she was forced to live under the care of her aunt, Vivian Friedrich. Howard Bennett had been a gentle and hard-working man who owned a small publishing business, while Grace Bennett was known for her kindness and love for music. Their home had once been filled with laughter, warm conversations, and soft piano melodies. But after their passing, everything changed. Vivian moved into the house and quickly took control of every part of Camilla's life. Vivian Friedrich was a woman who valued wealth and reputation above everything else. She often reminded Camilla that the house, the family business, and the money were now under her control. Though the house was large, Camilla often felt lonely within its walls. Vivian rarely showed kindness and treated Camilla more like a burden than family. Despite this harsh environment, Camilla developed a quiet strength. She spent much of her time in her room painting landscapes and reading books left behind by her parents. Painting became her escape, allowing her to express emotions she could not speak aloud. Even though her aunt's behavior was cold and controlling, Camilla never lost the kindness her parents had taught her. She helped neighbors when they needed assistance and volunteered at a small community center near the neighborhood. Many people admired her gentle spirit and calm personality. Deep inside, Camilla dreamed of a life where she could be free from Vivian's control and build a peaceful future of her own. She believed that someday she would find a place where kindness mattered more than wealth and where she could finally live the life her parents would have wanted for her. As David Sylvester grew older, the struggles of his childhood became the fuel that pushed him forward. While many teenagers in his neighborhood accepted the limits of their environment, David refused to believe that poverty would define his future. He spent most of his time studying, often staying up late at the small wooden table in their apartment, surrounded by books on engineering, finance, and architecture. His father Richard admired his dedication and always reminded him that patience and discipline would eventually open doors. His mother Laura, despite running her small grocery store all day, would sometimes sit beside him in the evenings, quietly encouraging him as he worked toward his goals. David eventually earned admission into a respected university where he studied civil engineering and business. Life at the university was not easy. He worked multiple part-time jobs to support himself, including delivering packages, assisting in construction sites, and tutoring other students in mathematics. The long hours were exhausting, but David viewed every challenge as a step closer to the life he had imagined since childhood. During this time, he became close friends with Marcus Reed, a law student who admired David's determination and sharp thinking. Marcus came from a modest background as well, and the two quickly formed a strong friendship built on trust and ambition. Together, David and Marcus often talked about the future. David shared his dream of transforming abandoned buildings into thriving developments, creating spaces where businesses and families could grow. Marcus believed in David's vision and promised that once he finished his law degree, he would help protect and guide the business side of David's plans. Those late-night conversations strengthened their bond and laid the foundation for something much bigger. While many people around them focused only on immediate survival, David and Marcus were quietly preparing for a future that neither of them fully realized would eventually change their lives forever. As Kamala Bennett grew into a young woman, the house she lived in still felt more like a place of obligation than a home. Vivian Frederick continued to control everything: finances, decisions, and even Kamala's daily routine. Vivian often reminded her that she was only allowed to stay because she had nowhere else to go. Despite these harsh words, Kamala carried herself with quiet dignity. She had inherited her mother Grace Bennett's gentle nature and her father Howard Bennett's calm intelligence. Rather than allowing bitterness to grow in her heart, she focused on small things that gave her peace. Kamala developed a deep love for art and music. In the evenings, when Vivian was away attending social gatherings, Kamala would sit near the window of her room with her paints and a small canvas. She often painted landscapes filled with sunlight, trees, and open skies, places that symbolized freedom. She also continued volunteering at the community center nearby, where she helped children with reading and art. The children adored her because she listened to them patiently and encouraged their creativity. Those moments reminded Kamala that kindness still existed in the world despite the coldness she experienced at home. Although Vivian rarely showed approval, Kamala quietly built her own dreams. She hoped one day to leave the house and create a peaceful life built on compassion rather than control. She imagined opening a small art studio where people could gather and express themselves freely. Many nights she would stand by the window, looking out at the lights of the city and wondering what her future might hold. She believed that somewhere beyond the restrictions of her aunt's house, there was a life waiting for her, a life where she could finally make her own choices and follow the path her heart desired. The city library was one of the few places where Kamala Bennett felt completely at peace. It was quiet, warm, and filled with the comforting scent of old books and polished wooden shelves. On most afternoons after helping at the community center, she would stop by the library to read or sketch ideas for her paintings. The library allowed her to forget, even if only briefly, the tension that waited for her back at Vivian Frederick's house. Kamala often chose a table near the large windows where sunlight poured through the glass and illuminated the pages of her notebook. On one particular afternoon, David Sylvester happened to be there as well. He had been spending long hours researching property development, construction methods, and financial strategies that could help him grow his small business idea. Although he had already begun working at construction sites, he knew knowledge would give him an advantage. David carried several thick books on engineering and urban design, and he sat at a nearby table focused entirely on his studies. However, as he worked through complicated notes and diagrams, he noticed the quiet concentration of the young woman across the room. Kamala was sketching a cityscape in her notebook, carefully designing buildings surrounded by green parks and open spaces. David found himself intrigued by the drawing. When Kamala briefly stepped away to return a book, he glanced at the sketch again and recognized the creativity behind it. When she returned, he politely commented on the drawing, praising the thoughtful design. Kamala was surprised by the compliment but smiled warmly. Their conversation began simply, discussing architecture, creativity, and the beauty of well-designed cities. What started as a brief exchange soon turned into a long and engaging discussion. Neither of them realized at that moment that this unexpected meeting inside the quiet library would eventually become the beginning of a relationship that would change both of their lives. After their first meeting at the library, David Sylvester and Camilla Bennett began seeing each other more often. At first their meetings were simple and natural. They would sit together in the same corner of the library, sharing ideas about architecture, art, and the future. David admired how Camilla saw beauty in things most people overlooked, while Camilla admired David's determination and clear vision for his life. Their conversations flowed easily, and both of them quickly realized they felt comfortable around each other in a way they rarely felt with others. Soon their meetings moved beyond the library. David would sometimes walk Camilla home after her volunteer work at the community center. Along the way they talked about their childhoods, their dreams, and the challenges they had faced growing up. David told her about his parents and the struggles of living in poverty, while Camilla spoke about her parents and how much she missed the warmth their home once had before Vivian took control. These conversations created a deep connection between them because they understood each other's hardships without judgment. David often felt that Camilla's kindness balanced his intense ambition, while Camilla felt that David's confidence gave her hope for a brighter future. As weeks passed, their friendship slowly grew into something deeper. David began bringing Camilla small gifts, like books about art or sketch pencils he thought she might enjoy. Camilla, in return, once gave him a painting she had made of a modern city skyline surrounded by green parks. She explained that it reminded her of the cities he dreamed of building someday. The painting meant more to David than any expensive gift could have. For the first time in his life, he felt truly understood. Their relationship grew stronger with every meeting, and though neither of them rushed to define their feelings, it was clear that something meaningful and lasting was beginning to grow between them. As David Sylvester's small construction ventures slowly began gaining attention, his life started to move at a much faster pace. What had once been a dream carefully discussed in quiet library corners was now becoming a demanding reality. He spent long hours meeting investors, visiting construction sites, and studying financial plans that could help him expand his projects. His close friend Marcus Reed had just completed his law studies and officially joined David as his legal advisor, helping him handle contracts and negotiations. Together they worked tirelessly, believing that the opportunities appearing before them could transform David's business into something far greater. However, with opportunity came distance. David's schedule grew heavier each week, leaving him with less time to see Camilla. Their conversations became shorter, often squeezed between David's busy workdays. Camilla understood his ambitions and never tried to hold him back. In fact, she admired his dedication and believed strongly in his vision. Yet there were moments when she quietly wished life would slow down long enough for them to simply enjoy each other's company the way they once did. When they did meet, David often spoke passionately about the properties he hoped to renovate and the city districts he dreamed of transforming. Camilla listened patiently, proud of his progress but also aware that his world was expanding rapidly. One evening, David received news that could change everything. A large investment firm had shown interest in supporting his development plans, but the opportunity required him to travel to another major city for several months to finalize negotiations and begin larger projects. The decision was not easy. David knew the opportunity could launch his career into a completely different level of success. When he told Camilla about it during one of their evening walks, she encouraged him to go, reminding him that dreams sometimes required sacrifice. Although both of them tried to stay hopeful, neither could fully ignore the quiet uncertainty that settled between them as David prepared to leave and pursue the future he had worked so hard to reach. After David left the city to pursue the opportunity that could transform his business, Camilla Bennett returned to the quiet routine of her life under Vivian Friedrich's roof. The large house still looked elegant from the outside, but inside it remained filled with cold silence and strict rules. Vivian continued managing the Bennett family properties and finances with absolute authority, often reminding Kamala that everything in the house existed under her control. Kamala tried to stay focused on the small parts of life that still brought her peace: her painting, her volunteer work at the community center, and the letters she occasionally wrote to David, even when his busy schedule meant his replies arrived less often. Over time, Kamala noticed something unexpected happening in her life that filled her with both fear and confusion. She realized she was facing a situation she had never imagined she would handle alone. With David far away building his career and Vivian showing no kindness or understanding, Kamala kept her worries hidden. She continued her daily routines quietly, determined not to let anyone see how much pressure she felt. The community center became her place of comfort, where helping children with art and reading allowed her to forget her own difficulties for a few hours each day. As weeks turned into months, Kamala began preparing herself for a future that suddenly looked very different from the one she had once imagined. She knew she would need strength and courage to face what lay ahead. Despite the uncertainty surrounding her life, she refused to lose hope. Her parents had always taught her that kindness and perseverance could guide a person through even the hardest moments. Holding on to those lessons, Kamala quietly promised herself that no matter what challenges appeared, she would find a way to protect the future she was now responsible for shaping. While Kamala faced quiet struggles back home, David Sylvester's life in the new city moved with relentless speed. The opportunity he had traveled for turned out to be far bigger than he had imagined. With the support of investors and the legal guidance of Marcus Reed, David began transforming neglected industrial properties into modern commercial spaces. His projects were bold and efficient, and investors quickly noticed the results. What started as one successful redevelopment soon turned into several large contracts. David's reputation grew as someone who could see potential in places others ignored. Years passed, and David's company expanded rapidly. His developments included office towers, residential complexes, and modern business districts that attracted major companies. Media outlets began describing him as one of the most promising real estate developers in the country. David remained disciplined and focused, often working late into the night reviewing plans and negotiating new deals. Marcus remained by his side through every major decision, ensuring contracts were fair and legally secure. As their company grew, they also formed partnerships with powerful investors, including a sharp-minded businessman named Liam Carter, whose aggressive strategies pushed the company to expand even faster. Eventually, David Sylvester reached a level of success few people from his background had ever imagined. His company owned properties across several cities, and his personal fortune placed him among the wealthiest developers in the industry. The once poor boy who had sketched buildings in a worn notebook was now a billionaire who shaped entire city skylines. Yet despite the wealth and recognition, there were quiet moments when David felt something missing. His life had become filled with meetings, business travel, and high-level negotiations, leaving little room for the personal connections he once valued. Without fully realizing it, the past he had left behind was slowly moving closer to him again, preparing to reappear in a way he never expected. Back in the city where Kamala Bennett had spent most of her life, the situation inside Vivian Frederick's house had grown increasingly tense. Vivian had always controlled the Bennett family property and finances, but over the years her greed had become even more obvious. She had begun selling parts of the estate that once belonged to Kamala's late father, Howard Bennett, claiming that maintaining such properties was too expensive. In truth, Vivian was using the money to maintain her luxurious lifestyle and social status. Kamala rarely questioned her decisions because she knew Vivian had the legal authority to make them. By this time, Kamala was no longer alone. Her son, Joseph Bennett, had become the center of her world. Joseph was a bright and curious little boy who asked endless questions about everything around him. He loved drawing just like Kamala and often spent hours sitting beside her while she painted. Though their lives were simple, Kamala worked hard to create a warm and loving environment for him within the cold walls of Vivian's house. She protected Joseph from the tension whenever possible, making sure he grew up surrounded by kindness rather than bitterness. However, Viviane Friedrich had little patience for the presence of a child in her home. One evening, after a heated argument about expenses and responsibility, Viviane made a harsh decision. She told Camilla that she and Joseph could no longer stay in the house. Viviane claimed that Camilla had become a burden and that the property was no longer meant to support them. Her words were cold and final. With very little time to prepare, Camilla was forced to gather their belongings and leave the only home she had known since childhood. Holding Joseph's hand tightly, she stepped outside into the uncertain night, determined to find a way to protect her son no matter how difficult the journey ahead might be. After being forced out of Viviane Friedrich's house, Camilla Bennett walked through the quiet streets holding Joseph's small hand while carrying a single bag filled with their belongings. The night air felt colder than usual, and the uncertainty ahead weighed heavily on her mind. She had very little money saved, and finding a place to stay on such short notice seemed almost impossible. Joseph, unaware of the full situation, stayed close to his mother and asked gentle questions about where they were going. Camilla smiled softly and reassured him that everything would be all right, even though she was still trying to figure out their next step. As they continued walking through the dimly lit streets, Camilla noticed a large building under construction on the edge of the city. The structure was incomplete, with exposed concrete walls and unfinished floors, but it offered protection from the wind and rain. Construction equipment stood silently around the site, and it appeared that work had stopped for the day. With no other options available, Camilla carefully guided Joseph inside the building. They found a small corner on one of the lower floors where they could rest without being easily noticed. Using her bag as a pillow and an old cloth as a blanket, Camilla tried to make the space as comfortable as possible for her son. Over the following days, Camilla quietly adjusted to their new reality. She continued visiting the community center during the day and searched for temporary work whenever she could, while Joseph stayed close by her side. At night they returned to the unfinished building, which slowly became their shelter. Despite the harsh circumstances, Camilla remained determined not to let Joseph feel hopeless. She told him stories, encouraged him to draw pictures, and reminded him that difficult times did not last forever. What she did not know was that the building they were staying in had recently been purchased by a powerful real estate developer whose visit to inspect the property would soon change their lives in a way she never expected. Across the city, David Sylvester had recently finalized the purchase of several properties as part of a large redevelopment project. Among them was an unfinished building on the edge of the city that he planned to convert into a modern residential complex. For David, the building represented another opportunity to transform an unused structure into something profitable and valuable. His business partner Liam Carter had been pushing for quick development, reminding David that delays could cost the company a great deal of money. Marcus Reed, as always, handled the legal paperwork and confirmed that the property had been transferred fully into David's company. One morning, David decided to visit the construction site personally. Although he had many managers who could inspect the building, David preferred seeing his properties with his own eyes. Accompanied by a few staff members, he arrived at the unfinished building and began walking through the lower floors. The concrete hallways echoed with the sound of footsteps as he examined the structure, noting areas where renovations would need to begin. During the inspection, one of the workers mentioned that there were rumors someone might be staying inside the building at night. David immediately frowned at the news. The property was private and under development, and allowing people to stay there could create legal and safety problems. Determined to handle the matter directly, he told the staff he would check the lower levels himself. As he walked deeper into the unfinished building, the quiet space felt unusually tense. Turning a corner, he noticed signs that someone had indeed been living there, small belongings, a blanket, and a few personal items placed carefully against the wall. Preparing to ask whoever was there to leave the property, David stepped forward. What he was about to see in the next moment would completely shock him and change everything he thought he knew about his past. David Sylvester stepped deeper into the unfinished section of the building, his footsteps echoing softly against the concrete floor. As he approached the corner where the belongings were placed, he noticed a small child sitting quietly on the ground, drawing on a piece of paper with a short pencil. The boy looked up when he heard the sound of footsteps. His large, curious eyes showed surprise but not fear. David paused for a moment, slightly confused. He had expected to find a group of trespassers or perhaps a homeless adult, not a small child calmly drawing pictures inside a construction site. Just then, a woman stepped forward from behind one of the unfinished walls. She had clearly been organizing a few things nearby and had quickly come when she heard someone approaching. When David saw her face, he froze completely. Standing in front of him was Camilla Bennett. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The years that had passed seemed to collapse into a single silent instant filled with shock and disbelief. Camilla's expression was equally stunned. She had never imagined that the owner of the building where she had taken shelter would be David, the man she once loved and had not seen for years. David's eyes slowly moved back to the boy who was still sitting on the ground holding his drawing. Something about the child immediately caught his attention. The boy's facial features, the shape of his eyes, and even the way he held his pencil reminded David of himself as a child. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. A quiet realization began forming in his mind, though he had not yet spoken the words aloud. Camilla looked at him with a mixture of nervousness and uncertainty, knowing that this moment could change everything. The silence between them carried the weight of many unanswered questions, and David could already feel that the truth behind this unexpected encounter was far more significant than he had ever imagined. For several long seconds, the unfinished building remained completely silent. David Sylvester stood still, trying to process what he was seeing. Camilla Bennett, the woman he had once loved deeply, was standing in front of him after years of separation. Beside her was a young boy whose resemblance to him was impossible to overlook. David slowly walked closer, his expression shifting from shock to confusion. The boy looked up at him with curiosity, studying his face as if trying to understand who this tall stranger was. Camilla gently placed a hand on Joseph's shoulder, sensing the tension in the air. She knew the moment she had always imagined might one day come had finally arrived, but the circumstances were far from what she had hoped for. David's voice, when he finally spoke, was calm but filled with questions. He asked Camilla how she had ended up living inside an unfinished building and why she had never contacted him during all the years he had been away. Camilla lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. She explained that life had taken difficult turns after he left and that circumstances had forced her into situations she never expected. David listened carefully, though his mind kept returning to the boy standing quietly beside her. Joseph continued holding his drawing while watching the conversation unfold. After a moment, David gently asked the question that had been forming in his mind since he first saw the child. He asked Camilla who the boy was. Camilla hesitated briefly before answering softly that the boy's name was Joseph Bennett. David looked at the child again, noticing the same thoughtful expression he had seen in the mirror many times during his own childhood. Although Camilla had not yet explained everything, David already sensed that the truth about Joseph would soon change his life in ways he had never prepared for. Camilla Bennett took a slow breath before speaking again. She knew that avoiding the truth would only make the situation more complicated. Joseph stood quietly beside her, still holding the drawing he had been working on earlier. David Sylvester remained calm but attentive, waiting for an explanation. Camilla gently guided Joseph to sit down nearby before turning back toward David. Her voice was steady, though the emotions behind her words were clear. She explained that shortly after David had left the city years ago, her life had changed in ways she could not have predicted. Without support from Vivian Friedrich and with very little control over the family property, she had been forced to handle every challenge alone. Camilla described how she focused on raising Joseph with the same kindness and patience her parents had once shown her. She worked small jobs whenever possible, continued helping at the community center, and did everything she could to create a stable environment for her son despite the difficulties surrounding them. David listened carefully, realizing that the years he had spent building his business had been very different from the years Kamala had spent raising a child. Kamala then looked toward Joseph and gently called him over. The boy walked closer, curious about the conversation but calm as always. Kamala softly explained that Joseph was her son and that she had raised him with love and determination through every challenge. As David looked at the boy again, the resemblance between them became even more obvious. Though Kamala had spoken carefully and respectfully, the truth was now impossible for David to ignore. The realization that Joseph might be his own child slowly settled in his mind, bringing with it a wave of emotions he had never expected to face. David Sylvester stood quietly for a moment after hearing Kamala's explanation. His thoughts were moving quickly, yet he kept his voice calm so Joseph would not feel uncomfortable. The boy looked up at him again with curious eyes. David slowly knelt down so he could speak to Joseph at eye level. He introduced himself politely and asked the boy about the drawing he had been working on earlier. Joseph's face immediately brightened as he began explaining the picture. It was a drawing of a large building surrounded by trees and small parks, with people walking peacefully around it. David listened carefully, surprised by how thoughtful the drawing was. Joseph explained that he liked imagining cities where people could live happily and where there were safe places for children to play. Kamala watched the interaction quietly, noticing something she had not expected. Joseph seemed naturally comfortable talking to David, and David himself appeared unusually gentle and patient. For a man known for making powerful business decisions, this softer side of him had rarely been visible to others. As the conversation continued, David began noticing more small similarities between himself and the boy. Joseph asked thoughtful questions, spoke calmly, and even held his pencil in a way that reminded David of his own childhood habits. These small details strengthened the realization that had already begun forming into David's mind. Although no formal confirmation had yet been spoken, the connection felt increasingly undeniable. For the first time in many years, David felt something stronger than business success or financial ambition. Standing there inside the unfinished building, he realized that this unexpected encounter might lead him toward a completely new chapter of life, one that involved not only Kamala, but also the intelligent young boy who might truly be his son. After spending some time speaking with Kamala and Joseph, David Sylvester realized that there were still many unanswered questions about how their lives had reached this point. Kamala had mentioned that Vivian Friedrich had forced them out of the house, but David sensed there was more behind the story. Later that day, he asked Marcus Reed to quietly investigate the legal history of the Bennett family property. Marcus was known for being thorough, and if there had been any manipulation or unfair dealings, he would be able to uncover it. Within a few days, Marcus returned with troubling information. The documents revealed that Vivian Friedrich had gradually taken control of the Bennett estate after the passing of Kamala's parents. Using complicated legal arrangements, Vivian had positioned herself as the primary manager of the properties and finances. Over time she had sold several assets that once belonged to Kamala's father, Howard Bennett, while keeping most of the profits for herself. Even more concerning was the discovery that Kamala technically still had rightful claims to parts of the estate that Vivian had been controlling. When David heard this information, he understood that Kamala's struggles had not simply been the result of bad circumstances. Vivian's decisions had played a direct role in pushing Kamala and Joseph into a difficult situation. Determined to correct what he now saw as an injustice, David decided to confront the matter directly. With Marcus preparing the necessary legal steps, David began planning a meeting with Vivian Friedrich. For him, the issue was no longer just about property or money. It had become personal, because the woman and child who had unknowingly taken shelter in his building were now deeply connected to his own life and future. A few days later, David Sylvester arrived at Vivian Friedrich's residence with Marcus Reed beside him. The house still carried the same grand appearance it had always had: tall windows, polished stone steps, and a perfectly maintained garden. Yet to David, the place now felt different because he understood the story behind it. Marcus carried a folder filled with legal documents that revealed the truth about how Vivian had managed the Bennett estate over the years. David's goal was not revenge but fairness. Vivian greeted them with her usual confidence, clearly surprised to see a powerful businessman like David standing at her door. At first she assumed the visit was related to a business proposal or property interest. However, the tone of the conversation changed quickly once Marcus calmly began explaining the legal findings. He presented evidence showing that several assets originally belonging to Camilla's father had been mismanaged or sold without properly acknowledging Camilla's rightful claim. Vivian attempted to defend herself, insisting that she had simply been protecting the estate. But the documents Marcus presented told a much clearer story. David remained composed throughout the discussion, speaking firmly but respectfully. He made it clear that Camilla had endured years of unnecessary hardship because of decisions that had placed personal gain above family responsibility. With the legal evidence now documented, Vivian had little choice but to cooperate. Marcus explained the steps that would restore Camilla's rightful share of the estate and correct the past arrangements. By the end of the meeting, Vivian's authority over those properties had effectively ended. As David and Marcus left the house, David felt a sense of closure. The injustice that had shaped Camilla's difficult years was finally being corrected, opening the door for a future where she and Joseph could live with stability and dignity. After the confrontation with Vivian Friedrich, David Sylvester focused his attention on helping Camilla and Joseph rebuild their lives. The unfinished building where he had first found them was quickly transformed from a construction site into a temporary residence where they could stay comfortably while other arrangements were made. David ensured the space was safe and properly furnished, something far different from the bare concrete floors where Camilla and Joseph had once slept. For Camilla, the change felt overwhelming at first. She had spent so long solving problems alone that accepting help required adjustment. Yet she could see that David's intentions were sincere. David also began spending more time with Joseph. The young boy was naturally curious and asked David many questions about buildings, cities, and construction equipment. David answered patiently, sometimes even bringing small sketches to show how buildings were designed. Joseph listened with excitement, clearly fascinated by the ideas. These moments created a natural bond between them. David started to realize that the joy he felt teaching Joseph simple things was different from any success he had achieved in business. It was quieter, but far more meaningful. Camilla observed these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and cautious hope. She could see that Joseph trusted David and enjoyed his company, and David seemed genuinely happy whenever the boy was around. Over time, conversations between Camilla and David also became more relaxed. They spoke about the past, about the choices they had made, and about the future they might build together. The years apart had changed both of them, but the connection they once shared had never completely disappeared. Slowly, without forcing anything, the three of them began forming something that felt like a family, one built not only on shared history, but also on understanding and care. Several months later, life looked completely different for Camilla Bennett and her son Joseph. With Marcus Reed's legal guidance, the matters surrounding the Bennett estate had been properly resolved, restoring the portion that rightfully belonged to Camilla. However, what mattered more to Camilla was the stability that had finally entered her life. David Sylvester had ensured that she and Joseph had a comfortable home in one of the newly completed residential buildings developed by his company. The place was peaceful, filled with sunlight and surrounded by green spaces where Joseph could play safely. Joseph quickly adapted to the new environment. He attended a nearby school and continued drawing the imaginative buildings he loved so much. David often visited in the evenings, sometimes helping Joseph improve his sketches or explaining simple ideas about how buildings were designed. Their bond had grown naturally over time, and David openly embraced the responsibility of being present in Joseph's life. The boy looked up to him with admiration, seeing not only a successful businessman but also someone who listened to his ideas and encouraged his curiosity. For Camilla and David, the future was no longer clouded by the uncertainties that had once separated them. They had both faced difficult years that tested their strength and patience, but those challenges had also shaped the people they had become. Now they approached life with greater understanding and appreciation for what truly mattered. The moment when David had walked into the unfinished building expecting to evict strangers had unexpectedly brought them back together. From that surprising encounter grew a new beginning, one built on honesty, compassion, and the shared determination to create a better life for their family. And that brings us to the end of today's story. The world of luxury often hides stories deeper than what meets the eye. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories on luxury jewel stories. Until our next story, take care and stay tuned for more.